So, you want to own a medieval fish weir on the Somerset coast. You picture two stone arms trapping a silver harvest every time the tide retreats. Then a net tears, half the catch escapes, and a merchant's cart arrives after the remaining fish have begun to spoil. The sea delivered your inventory for free. Why then can one storm, one lawsuit, or one late buyer leave the owner poorer than the fisherman? Set the scene around the year 1300 in Minehead Bay, facing the broad tides of the Bristol Channel. Records from that period counted 5 fish weirs in the bay, so your trap does not stand alone. You do not build boats to chase shoals beyond the horizon. Instead, you build a fixed trap and persuade the tide to bring the fish to you. 2 long walls spread across the intertidal shore and converge at a narrow seaward opening called the gut. When the tide rises, fish move across the flooded structure with the incoming water. As the sea withdraws, the walls guide them toward a net or wicker trap at the point. The water leaves, the fish remain, and revenue seems to appear on wet stones. The tide performs the journey, the structure waits, and somebody else buys the catch. Yet, the valuable thing is not simply a V-shaped pile of stone. Before the first repair, you must answer who controls this strip of moving shoreline. Medieval fisheries could belong to a manor, monastery, lord, tenant, or holder of a specific fishing right. A religious house might retain the fish for its kitchens while a tenant managed the work. Another owner might lease the fishery for rent and transfer much of the operating risk to local fishermen. Your representative operation combines both arrangements. You hold the recognized right to maintain one coastal weir and sell most of its catch. In return, you owe rent, customary deliveries, or a share of fish to the superior rights holder. You also need lawful access across the shore and across any neighboring land used by carts and workers. The walls are visible, but the business rests on permissions that cannot be seen from the beach. Magna Carta ordered fish weirs removed from English rivers because they obstructed boats and trade. Coastal weirs were accepted, partly because they were less likely to block navigation. Safer does not mean unquestioned. A boatman can still complain about hidden stakes, a neighboring fishery can dispute your boundary, and a lord can challenge your title. Owning the working means defending its location as carefully as maintaining its walls. The warden watches the moon, weather, wind, and remembered rhythm of the tides. The working schedule is written by water that will cover the workplace whether the crew is finished or not. As the tide withdraws, laborers step onto the exposed shore carrying bars, mallets, baskets, rope, and replacement stakes. The surface is slick, uneven, and scattered with weed left by the previous tide. Surviving Minehead weirs show the scale of the asset. Their stone arms can extend roughly 100 meters and contain rounded beach stones heavy enough to require both hands. Some walls rise more than a meter inside the trap, with a core of smaller gravel between outer courses. The crew begins by walking both arms and marking gaps with sticks. 2 men lever a rounded stone from the beach while a third rebuilds the wall beneath it. Others pack smaller material into the core so water passes without carrying the structure away. Unlike a bridge, however, the foundation disappears beneath salt water before anyone can admire it. At the western arm, last night's current has opened a low breach. The warden orders 4 men to shift their tools and close it before repairing anything else. Maintenance is therefore a daily allocation of scarce labor against future failure. Spend too little, and the tide enlarges every neglected gap. Spend too much, and repair wages consume the value of the fish before the trap fills. Moving, placing, and replacing those stones is the expense. The sea gives you raw material while repeatedly charging labor to keep it in position. Near the gut, another crew drives timber stakes into the bed and checks the net line. The narrow opening concentrates both fish and water, so its equipment suffers the greatest strain. A net must hold the catch without becoming a sail that tears itself apart. Rope fibers swell, knots loosen, stakes rot, and sharp debris cuts mesh below the surface. The net maker examines every repair, while the warden argues that the tide will not wait for perfection. They settle for replacing one damaged panel and reinforcing the lower rope. The crew carries its tools inland as the first water reaches the outer wall. Water covers the stones, spreads across the bay, and hides every repair beneath a smooth surface. Small fish pass above the arms while larger fish move with the flood across the drowned trap. Nobody can count the inventory entering because the inventory is alive, invisible, and free to leave. The owner must wait through the high tide with no guarantee that the structure is filling. This is not passive income. When the water turns, the warden and crew return to the shore. The ebb gathers speed and draws fish towards the narrowing arms. Silver bodies flash in shallow channels as the water funnels toward the gut. Then the repaired net begins to bow. Seaweed and driftwood have collected against the mesh, adding weight faster than water can escape. The lower rope slips from one stake and opens a dark gap beneath the net. Fish pour toward it while two workers wade forward with a spare line. One man braces the stake as another loops the rope and the warden shouts over the water. They close the gap, but a visible part of the catch has already vanished with the tide. The loss appears later as disappointing sales from a tide that looked abundant. The emergency also shortens the collection window and adds another damaged panel to tomorrow's work. A small maintenance saving has returned as missing inventory, urgent labor, and reduced confidence in the trap. As the water falls below the walls, the harvesting crew enters with baskets and hand nets. The catch is sorted on wet stones into valuable sailfish, household fish, small fish, and waste. Some can travel fresh to nearby buyers if the cart departs immediately. Others need gutting, cleaning, salting, or rapid local consumption. Workers kneel at rough boards while carriers move filled baskets toward the high water mark. The warden counts loads, but the number of baskets does not equal the number of saleable fish. Size, species, condition, season, and buyer demand all alter the value of the same physical weight. A damaged fish caught beside it may become cheap salted stock or no sale at all. Sorting therefore creates revenue categories before the market sets a final price. It also creates arguments because workers may be paid by time, share, catch, or local custom. If fishermen receive a share, they care intensely about how the warden classifies each basket. If they receive wages, the owner carries more of the weak catch risk. A share system preserves cash during bad tides, but gives away more upside during strong ones. Net makers produce and repair the equipment that closes the gut. Carriers move fish across ground too soft or narrow for a loaded cart. Drivers, packers, salters, market sellers, and clerks continue the operation after the tide has finished. Watchmen protect a structure that cannot be locked inside a building. Today the fresh fish cart is late. Its driver arrives after a wheel repair delayed him on the inland road. Baskets wait near the shore while the warden repeatedly checks the sky and touches the fish. Fresh fish can command a premium because freshness is difficult to preserve. Every hour without a buyer reduces the chance of earning the best rate. The crew shades the baskets and spends salt to protect part of the catch. Salt extends selling time, but it is purchased inventory, not a gift from the sea. Curing also needs barrels, tubs, knives, labor, clean space, and somebody who knows the process. The late cart has therefore changed both the product and the revenue model. What began as premium fresh fish becomes lower-priced preserved stock carrying extra material costs. If the owner supplies a monastery or manor, part of the catch may never become cash at all. Fish delivered as rent, obligation, or household provision has real value without filling the payroll chest. A table can look prosperous while the business remains short of coin. Religious practice supports demand because many consumers replace meat with fish on fast days. A large catch after the important market day may sell worse than a smaller catch delivered at the right moment. This timing mismatch turns abundance into a storage and bargaining problem. When every nearby trap lands fish together, merchants can lower their offers. The fish must move quickly, while the buyer can simply point toward the next basket. Your fixed trap has produced a perishable commodity in a temporary buyer's market. Two figures cross the exposed shore after the regular crew has left. They know the tide, the path, and exactly where the valuable baskets are collected. One cuts a section of net while the other removes fish held in a smaller trap. By morning, the thieves are gone and the next tide has erased most footprints. Poaching removes inventory, but damaged gear multiplies the loss into future tides. The owner responds by paying watchmen and marking equipment with recognizable signs. Guards reduce theft without creating a single additional fish. If enforcement becomes violent or arbitrary, it can also provoke local resistance and more deliberate damage. The fishery therefore spends money defending an exclusive right against people who see moving fish as a common resource. A neighboring owner may claim that your extended wall redirects fish away from his smaller weir. River users may argue that fixed traps block navigation or prevent fish from moving upstream. Magna Carta's famous order against river fish weirs reveals how serious that conflict became. London wanted fish, yet merchants also needed open water for boats. The same structure could create food revenue for one owner and transport losses for everyone passing it. Coastal placement protects your modeled weir from the broad river prohibition, but boundaries and access remain contestable. One morning, a trading boat approaches too close during a high tide. Its steering oar catches an outer stake hidden below the surface. The crew frees the boat, but a cargo owner arrives later demanding compensation for delay and damage. He claims your wall extends beyond its customary limit. You claim his pilot ignored a known route around the trap. Neither argument moves fish to market while the dispute is heard. A local official may order stakes removed, an opening widened, or evidence of the fishery right produced. Compliance reduces catching power, while resistance risks fines and the loss of the entire privilege. Legal defense is therefore part of maintenance, even though no hammer touches the weir. The charter, court memory, boundary witness, and customary practice can be worth more than the stones. Wind drives a storm tide across the bay, and waves strike the exposed shore at an unfamiliar angle. The outer arm absorbs repeated impacts while driftwood crashes against the net stakes. By morning, a long section of wall has flattened and the gut frame leans toward the sea. The weir has not disappeared, but it cannot concentrate fish effectively. Every tide during the repair period becomes missing revenue that can never be recovered. Laborers gather scattered stones while carpenters replace stakes and net makers rebuild the damaged mouth. Animals and carts haul timber that the beach does not provide. Emergency work demands more hands precisely when the fishery has stopped producing saleable catch. The owner must spend reserve cash before knowing whether the next repaired tide will contain enough fish. Postponing repair protects cash today, but lets currents widen the breach tomorrow. Borrowing restarts production faster, but gives a creditor a claim on future catches. The storm has converted a supposedly permanent asset into a race between repair cost and liquidity. Even after reconstruction, the business faces competition that stone walls cannot chase. Other coastal weirs intercept the same moving resource at different points along the shore. Boat crews can follow seasonal shoals beyond the fixed reach of your arms. Expanding commercial sea fishing offers merchants larger and more varied supplies from mobile producers. Historic coastal weirs reached their broad medieval peak before growing sea fisheries changed the competitive landscape. Your trap still works, but its ownership no longer guarantees the best access to fish or buyers. The fixed asset is efficient only while fish routes, shore conditions, law, and markets continue to favor its location. If the channel shifts, the tide may drain around yesterday's carefully built walls. If the harbor expands, officials may value navigation more than your customary catch. If buyers prefer larger marine landings, your local abundance loses negotiating power. Ownership provides control over one place, not control over the ecosystem or the market. Repair crews, net makers, guards, salt merchants, and carters expect payment throughout the season. Rent and customary obligations may be due regardless of how many fish enter the trap. Fresh sales produce quick coin only when the catch, cart, market, and buyer align on the same day. Preserved stock delays the sale while consuming salt, barrels, labor, and storage. Credit sales record revenue, but leave the owner financing the merchant's business as well as his own. An abundant fishery can therefore become asset-rich, food-rich, and cash-poor at the same time. To compare possible outcomes, use modeled units rather than recovered medieval prices. Assume the fishing right, basic weir, access route, and working yard already exist. You begin the operating year with 100 units of liquid reserve. In an ordinary year, the gross catch appears to be worth 220 units at expected market prices. Small, damaged, escaped, or spoiled fish remove 40 units before usable value reaches the books. The remaining catch creates 180 units of usable economic inflow. Only 140 units arrive as cash during the year. 20 units feed the estate household or workers in kind, and 20 remain owed by buyers. Repair labor, harvest wages, and specialist work consume 45 cash units. Stone handling, stakes, wattle, rope, Nets and routine reconstruction consume 30 units. Transport, salt, barrels, market fees, and processing consume 25 units. Rent, legal administration, access payments, and other fixed obligations cost 15 units. Watchmen, clerical work, tools, and minor emergencies consume another 20 units. Total cash operating cost reaches 135 units. Economic inflow exceeds those costs by 45 units before major replacement and long-term obligations. Cash increases by only 5 because part of the catch became food or unpaid credit. Reserve 10 units for the next storm repair, and the owner has no safe cash distribution at all. The ordinary weir feeds people, supports workers, and records value without making its owner feel rich. In a good year, strong tides bring valuable fish, the net holds, and merchants arrive promptly. Usable inflow reaches 250 units while 225 arrives as cash. Higher activity lifts cash costs to 155 units. The operation creates 70 units of new cash before the repair reserve. After retaining 25 units for walls, nets, and access disputes, 45 units can reach the owner. This is the year that justifies the privilege and attracts envy from every nearby claimant. In a weak year, fish movement changes and repeated small breaches reduce the catch. Usable inflow falls to 115 units while only 90 arrives in cash. Costs decline only to 125 because maintenance and legal obligations remain. The books show a 10-unit operating loss, but the cash reserve falls by 35. The owner can survive because the opening reserve absorbs the mismatch. Another weak year would force delayed repairs, borrowing, or a lease of the operating right. The catastrophic outcome combines failures that reinforce one another. A storm flattens one arm just as an official orders the gut widened during a navigation dispute. Poachers cut the replacement net, a buyer refuses deteriorated fish, and the major market week passes without delivery. Usable inflow falls to 60 units while only 45 arrives as cash. Emergency rebuilding, ordinary labor, dues, transport, and legal defense consume 150 units. The operation loses 90 units economically and burns 105 units of cash. The original reserve disappears, yet the shore still contains walls, stakes, trapped pools, and a disputed right. Physical wealth remains visible after liquidity has failed. The owner must borrow against future catches, accept a powerful partner, surrender the lease, or abandon the working. So who performed the labor and who kept the surplus? Fishermen and laborers rebuilt the walls, set the net, entered the tide, sorted the catch, and carried it ashore. Net makers, processors, guards, drivers, and sellers turned trapped fish into a marketable product. The warden coordinated the narrow windows when water, labor, transport, and demand could meet. Workers faced the immediate physical risk while the operator carried wages, spoilage, and repair timing. The superior lord, manor, or monastery controlled the right that made exclusion and collection legally defensible. Merchants controlled the price whenever too many fish reached the market at once. Only after labor, maintenance, transport, dues, losses, credit, and reserves did the owner keep a surplus. You thought the weir harvested free fish. It actually sold lawful control over one narrow path through moving water. The tide supplied the fish. Labor captured them. The rights holder kept the surplus.